So Nintendo doesn't have that luxury when talking about, say, Xenoblade, right? They have to tell you why to buy it, not like why they individually like it. If it doesn't translate into a way that says this is why you should buy it, right? No one can really go, oh, polygamy is cool. Actually, play Xenoblade, right? But it's just a fan can.
Yeah. If you listen to my personal podcast where I ramble to myself, you'll know I use a lot of machine translation. It's an incredibly helpful tool as somebody who is deeply engaged with Japanese content, the Japanese game industry, yet does not know enough Japanese to be actually capable of navigating that space. Machine translation has helped me, read articles. It's helped me interact with people online, ask questions, and it also has helped me literally sit down and play through games like Buddy Mission Bond, that video I did, and things like that. So it's this really helpful tool. But at the same time, in talking to various translators and being kind of familiar with the fan translation scene, I know it's a tool that has a lot of challenges that kind of come with it. And knowing exactly what those challenges are and what they mean can be a difficult thing to parse through when you're just talking initially kind of about like machine translation bad and not that much else. So I wanted to talk to Cargodin about this. Cargodin's a friend of mine who is in the fan translation scene. I've played Napple and Blue Legend of Water, which they were the kind of head translators on. I don't know the title exactly. And they also have worked on Planet Laika, Linda Cubed, and they're working on Kowloon's Gate as well, I believe. So, but I didn't really want to focus too much on like, is machine translation good or bad per se? So I wanted to talk to them more about the act of translation. And so that kind of leads us into our discussion here, where we're talking a little bit about kind of their early interactions with Japanese online, and then also how people's relationship with Japanese text has changed on the internet. Changing social norms around, how you navigate translation, how machine translation impacts the way people view and use Japanese, how they can be used to like build certain stories or hyperbolize to create, a news story, and how machine translation can impact our ability to learn Japanese long term. I will say a lot of game names and people get kind of thrown around. Just know that most of these game names are fan translations that Cargodin has had some experience with, whether it be directly or indirectly, as well as a lot of people's names, which likely are people who are directly working on these projects with or without Cargodin as well. When did you start studying in general?
I think by that point I was practicing hiragana and katakana, and I was mostly just writing things down. And I still do that. Like my biggest takeaway with studying is just writing things down. Even if I am like a slow learner, it's like I know how to write things now. So, and that it changes how you look at things. When you know how to write it, you know how to look at it.
What do you mean by you know how to write it, you know how to look at it? I don't know if I actually know what that means.
Uh, um, well, so for kanji, let's take a kanji. Do you know what the individual strokes and the stroke pieces in a piece of kanji are called? It starts with an R. If there's an R word to detail what the strokes in a kanji are
Is it a
called.
radical? Okay.
Yes, radicals. I realized I asked a dumb question, but yeah. So when you learn the radicals, you can actually search up kanji by those radicals on Japanese dictionary sites and on English dictionary sites. But they also kind of spell out. So you have akasatana, but what comes next are the radicals, and that will be how your kanji is sorted when the alphabet's pretty close. And when you learn how to do those and you know how to compartmentalize and break apart kanji, you can write it. You can read it much faster, right? So it just takes a lot of note taking for something like that. I don't think there's any amount of just reading kanji that's going to help you learn it as an adult. Like I think that your brain is too beyond that
You just need to go into
ever be like,
memorization
yeah,
mode,
I'm
basically.
definitely going to remember this. Right. And so like it helps to know, and once you write something like 18 times, right? Like I like to write fan mail in Japanese. Once you write something 18 times, you know it because you don't want to look it up anymore.
And were you writing fan mail back
So
then, or when did you start writing fan mail?
I had written fan mail in English back then, and like It would kind of depend. At that point, I would need like an English source, like, hey, this is how you write a fan letter to like Tokyo Pop, or this is how you write a fan letter to. I was writing to Beckett and like For Kids Magazine or Kids WB Magazine back when like Digimon was airing and stuff, and I would draw fan art for those magazines. So it's something that I always just did.
Yeah.
But then I was like, oh, I want to figure out how to do this for like Japanese artists that I like. And so I just kind of like dug into that. Now that I can look up in like Japanese sites, like, hey, what is this person's address? It's a lot easier than trying to find it in English.
I think maybe through this, I'm just trying to get an understanding of why you started engaging with Japanese and like what you were getting use out of Japanese before you got into fan translation. That.
So back with Shaman King at the time, there really wasn't enough information in English out.
Mhm.
Like certain songs were not translated by fans, certain books weren't coming out. Shaman King was one of those canceled early series. The final volume of Shaman King was originally not going to be printed, that they needed people to come write in letters and petition to have it printed.
Mhm.
They needed at least 10,000 letters or something like that to get it printed because of how bad, like, Shaman King got canceled hard.
Mhm.
Capital HARD. It was very brutal. And so it basically ends on a note. If someone's interested in Shaman King spoilers, right? This has been changed since. But at the end of volume 32, it went, okay, we're going to go fight the final boss tomorrow. Good night. And that's how it ended.
So was the
It
intention
ended
to
on
end it quickly? Because like I know there's like some manga, like there's this one I watched where it was like it was a whole or read was like the whole thing was like a girl was like stuck in a mirror and then like they got canceled and they had to wrap it up in one chapter and just how they solved it was just he dropped the mirror and it broke it and she fell out of the mirror and that was the solution. And like, oh cool. And they all went to the beach, basically. Was it that kind of situation of like they were just trying to wrap it up and because the publisher was like, please wrap it up?
yeah, but they said like you're wrapping it up like
Yeah.
now. And because otherwise like it was a tournament with 64
Mhm.
participants. So the first like 10 volumes of the story take place over the span of like 6 months.
Mhm.
And then the next like 7 volumes take over the span of maybe 3 months. And then the rest of the tournament takes place in the span of like 3 days. And so there's a whole lot of stuff happening but also nothing really moving at the same
Yeah.
time. Um Especially since the winner of the tournament was kind of like foretold like 20 volumes in advance, and that was a major plot point. And then, okay, that happened, but there was a lot of tension that was kind of removed from it because he tried to, I think, lean into something more seinen than shonen. Right? It was a little bit older in what was going on. You had a protagonist that was deliberately not hot blooded. There's probably a lot of things when you're competing with series like Naruto and Bleach and One Piece that it was falling short on, right?
Mhm.
But some people really like that. And I think that's why the Shaman King fan base is as loyal as it is. And that's why when it was getting canceled, people wrote in to get that final volume printed. And then there were also fan books that existed. There were fan like um gatherings and circles and stuff that were still going on. And you see that stuff kind of from afar when you're in the States, but you're like, oh man, this would be fun to participate in,
Yeah.
right? But the most that you can really do is just try and figure out what the fuck this song says, right? Like Lights had a character song that never really got fan translated. And I was like, ugh,
Yeah.
right? So it was very despairing. But the tricky thing is, how do you even like find the lyrics and stuff first, right? Because if you're like 14 years old and you don't know Japanese, it's not something you make up by ear.
Yeah.
And, but even then, if I had, like, the kanji and stuff for it, that's something I would still have to, like, pen and paper. And if I like, oh, pen and paper it, just like, "Oh, I'm Japanese in my sketchbook," that sort of thing,
Mhm.
right? So, there is a lot to be gained just by having them. But you don't really know how to look for that stuff without knowing anything about Japanese, period, right?
Yeah, I mean, like at the time, what resources would you even have available to you?
Mm, like, just Google, not even Google Translate. You had straight
Yeah.
Google. You had fan blogs talking about Japanese and stuff, and you could bother people online and be like, "What does this say?" Right? Like back then, I think people were braver to go, "Hey, what does this say?" than they are now. Like you kind of have to present some point of example of what you're looking for,
Yeah.
whether it's machine translation or not. Be like, "Hey, I did some of the work," right? And I think that there's an important quality to that too, right? Like coming in with some of the work done yourself. But at the same time, the fear of having enough to like be taken seriously and not be accused of just being lazy and stuff like that is also like
Yeah.
tricky. That's kind of a side tangent though. But
Well, I think anything, like if you go to a group and you're like, "Hey, I need help with something," there, I think it becomes very obvious very quickly if you didn't do any legwork whatsoever, and you're just like, "Please tell me the answer." um, but
right. I think you got away with that a lot more when you're on the older internet. I think even 10 years ago you could get away without having a
yeah,
portfolio before asking something on Yahoo Questions. You could just ask it. And I do think that some of that has gone away since. I think, especially since a lot of people's questions kind of get used for content. I think that it makes certain people wary about posting the bad fan art to get redlined, unless they go to a reputable source for it. I think it makes people scared to go, "Hey, here's my Japanese and stuff like that. Can someone fix it?" Without going to a reputable source for it,
yeah,
right? It always has to be like one reputable source talking to another.
mm,
And I think that spooks other people from engaging,
yeah.
right? Like if I'm talking about ROM hacking stuff with Hilltop in a thread, right? People will probably really, really enjoy seeing that, but I can also see that scaring people away from wanting to participate, if that makes sense.
Because it's just so technically dense, or
I think technically dense, but I think also because it puts up this illusion that there has to be like this minimum bar of entry to talk about it.
mm,
It's like if you're watching two really skilled fan artists interact with each other and you're like, "Oh, I could never be friends with these people." Right?
yeah,
Like let's say you had like I think it's just something that people worry about
yeah.
is that they get scared to interact and it's scared to pick up like a particular skill set or interact with particular people in say the Shaman King or the Zelda community,
Well,
right?
there's also like a parasocial layer to it as well. I feel like where if you feel like you
Yeah.
are outside of somebody like who is, yeah, I guess what you're just trying to say is like if you're not part of the skilled group of people, it kind of discourages you from ever pursuing it because you're like, I don't have that skill already, maybe, or maybe just asking for help
Yeah.
to develop that skill. So
Right. I think that people are apprehensive to ask for help and stuff unless someone specifically makes themselves available to
yeah,
it. So, but I think that back then I think people were a lot more bolder and I think that's why we have so many examples now of people being bold or people being lazy is because we were all that person at least once in the past,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, I don't know. I think that the while I do think that avenues exist for people to go and ask Japanese questions, and I think that there are places for people to go post their art and get critique and stuff, I do think that it is way less public,
Mm,
I want to say, or way less free for all
yeah,
than it used to be. So, and part of that is just the how decentralized the internet feels now. Like ROM hacking, I don't even know if I wanted to post a ROM hack now, I don't know what site I would want to do it on, right?
yeah.
And so that kind of scares everybody that's still working on things like, okay, well, where is it even going? Who is, we don't necessarily like everyone that's running new ROM hack sites. We're not necessarily on like sides with everybody. Everyone's different about this sort of thing. But I think it also kind of ties into that with fan culture as
Do you
well.
feel like at the time as well that there's like maybe less of a footprint of people as well, so it's a little easier to just reach out to somebody and have no idea who they are, versus in most other situations today, I feel like everybody has some level of footprint, so it's like easier to tell who somebody is before you reach out to them. Does that matter?
Agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. People have that portfolio
Yeah.
to speak for themselves. I think that people think that they have to have a portfolio when they kind of don't.
Yeah. Do you think the old way you translated with the resources, did that help you build a certain skill set that you think maybe it's harder to build today with that, or
If I had Google Translate back then, I think I could see myself like cheating more
mm.
and trying to figure out how to cheat more. But I think when you know that Google Translate is bad
Yes.
and does not spit out English, like there's something very freeing in knowing, oh, you know what, I'm not going to get an English translation out of Google Translate.
Yeah.
Once you know that about Google Translate back then, it's like you know that there's more work that you have to put in before you sound convincing, right? The more dangerous things about DeepL and Google Translate now, with the AI and them kind of pushing towards a proper English statement and putting that into an equal priority as translating the text and stuff, you're going to run into inaccuracies, but they're going to be way more deceiving, especially to younger folk that might like. I wouldn't necessarily mind if people use Google Translate as a tool.
Yeah.
Right. I think now part of me being like an old person, just being like, oh no, what if it's bad for the environment? Right. It's not something, is Google Translate killing the trees?
A lot of things are killing the trees in this world, I will say. So
Right.
it's like,
But at that point, do you ethically just say, like, so I've always been a proponent of if you do not know, Google it first.
yeah,
Google will tell you if something is grammar or not,
yeah,
right? Like if you have a verb stem, Google is going to tell you more about that verb stem. Different internet plugins for your browser, like Rikai Samo, Rikai Chan, or whatever, are going to tell you more about that verb stem than Google Translate will.
yeah.
But if you're going through OCR and you're handwriting things by radicals and you are fucking up that radical, Google will let you know because it will never pull up that radical for you.
Mm.
You will never find the kanji that you're looking for if you're not writing it
Yeah.
correctly, right?
I've even had this with like typoing words as well. Like you can't find the kanji you're looking for if you type in like, the katakana or the hiragana wrong, right? It's like, oh, if you press tab, like I can't find the kanji I need for this kind of thing.
Right. So interestingly for Google Translate and Google Docs,
Mm.
right? Is that if you do type in something inaccurate, you will get grammar checks on it. You will get the underline, you will get the green squiggly lines or whatever to say, hey, fix this. This word is
Yeah.
wrong or this verb is wrong. And which is cool. It introduces its own new terrors to it, of course, if you're practicing on learning how to make statements yourself.
Mhm.
But Google too will have a did you mean such and such? And that will also apply if you're just putting a statement into Google proper. So if you are like, I'm not sure about this particular, so different dialects are a little tricky with Japanese in that when you're first getting exposed to different dialects, the main takeaway is that the particles are different,
Mm.
which is the worst thing that could happen. It's the worst thing you could change up because at that point you're still learning what some of those particles do in execution, right? And because like a Japanese class, the first couple of years in a Japanese class are not going to tell you the full propensity of how no is used.
Mhm.
Like you'll understand what no says in Japanese, but you would not necessarily get what it's trying to pull in English, right? And I think that not knowing how to word things in English is how you get weird isms like these feelings that I cannot express, right? People make fun of that particular lyric in those like J-pop songs or
Mhm.
whatever. But just because it's kind of like a backward statement, it's not deliberate in the way that like casual English is spoken, right?
Japanese in a lot of ways is backwards compared to English, right? Like structurally when it comes to
Right,
sentence
right.
structure.
Right. Yeah, structurally it is very backwards,
Yeah.
right? And an execution like that shouldn't necessarily translate into English the same
Yeah.
way, right? And Google, even Google AI knows that, right? Like Google AI will try and give you something very deliberate and like flipped in that
Yeah.
way. It knows how to write what it wants to say in casual, deliberate English. And DeepL does too. And you see it when people post this and go, this is definitely what it says, right?
Yeah.
And you have, and Google Translate is kind of interesting too because it will spell out everything at the bottom, right? It'll give you the Romanized version of what you're saying. You can highlight things. It has dictionaries for alternate words,
Mhm.
right? So it's neat for that. But at the same time, if you need Google Translate to do those things for you, you're probably at a stage where you have a different dictionary site of choice.
Like for Japanese
Yes,
study kind of thing.
English dictionary sites and there are some Japanese dictionary sites, and some of them focus on slang. Like there are specific like Pixiv or Nico Nico slang
Mhm.
dictionaries. I never really have to interact with those, thank God. But like Weblio might be handy, and that's a dual language dictionary site. And you can look up how to say it in Japanese. If you look up Japanese to English dictionaries, that is so much more helpful to me than using something like Google Translate or using an English to Japanese dictionary.
But that requires a level of knowledge about Japanese already to navigate that to some extent. Would you say that's true or no?
Yeah, I would say so. But if you're just learning it, I think that learning how to look that up and learning what can be looked up versus what can't can really change your experience in using Japanese as a resource online.
Well, specifically, it sounds like in learning Japanese through it, right? Because I think the way I look at machine translation off the time is that it is the shortcut way of I am not going to invest the time into actually knowing what Japanese is. So this is like the best approximation I can get as somebody who doesn't know Japanese, right? So like when you start talking about like dictionary sites, I think when you are digging into those, there's probably a more of a commitment to being like, I'm actually interested in learning vocab. I'm actually interested in learning what these Japanese words mean, not just the core
Mhm.
understanding of what these words are trying to say. Does that sound right?
Right. I mean, if you know what you're doing or you are studying,
Mhm.
right? Um, let's see. Like, let's say you have a piece of flint. It's not a fire, and it's not the sole tool you can use to start a fire. But if you know how to start fires, flint is a very important thing to
Yeah.
have, right? And it can save you a lot of time, right? It's not the only thing you might need, but it certainly saves you a lot of time if you know what to do with
Mhm.
it, right? Flint is nothing if you don't know what to do with it, and you just need the fire. So, like someone that just wants to start a fire might want a match,
Yeah.
right? And they might never figure out what to do with the flint correctly,
Yeah.
right? So, but someone that's like, hey, I've had some training in Boy Scouts and stuff. I have this flint.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it comes off in my head.
That makes sense.
So it's handy for that. I'm not really against any tool existing if it is being used by someone that has an actual interest in learning. Because I think that someone that has an actual interest in learning isn't going to just ham in Japanese text and spit out Japanese text and post it. Right? If you want the skill set, that's not the skill set. That's not how it's gained.
Let's put out like a very clear example of like what you think is like a bad use of that in that case then. Like, what would you say would be an action that would be taken by somebody that feels negligent when using machine translation?
I think that when people are taking Japanese lines from quote censored video games
Mhm.
and they're just kind of under the impression that something is censored or something was like vocalized, I'll say. A lot of times the counter arguments are brought up with machine translated text because of course they would be.
So in some ways, it's almost the the I don't know if irrational is the right word, but the irrational. I'm going to say irrational. I don't know. That feels like a harsh word, so maybe it's not the greatest word to use. But the irrational trust in machine translation to do something even better than humans.
Well, not even that. A lot of people will take machine translation and pass it off as their own. Right? It's very strange to actually run into people who are honest about using AI translation and who are very honest about using MTL.
Hmm.
Like, people like that do seem open to criticism,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I use it for my news stories all the time. That is literally like I just when I go through like, 50 Japanese articles, I'm not reading those in Japanese, right? I'm just going Google translate this page so I can like pick out if anything catches my eye, right? So,
Right.
yeah.
And I think that if you're looking for something like standard,
Mhm.
right? I'm not necessarily against that. But then you run into people who want to quote Sakurai or you want to run into people who want to quote Yoshi P.
Mhm.
And they come up with a deliberately hyperbolized version of what they said. Right? People will do that without machine translation. Taikuchi kind of came under fire for misquoting Yoshi P seemingly on purpose. Because it's like, if you know Japanese, why would you quote this like this for clickbait? That becomes unethical, right?
Oh, so in that
And
case
you have
that's like
people
more
that
of
misquote.
a clickbait thing like a journalist practice or maybe not. I don't know if journalist is the right
Right. But
term for
people
that,
will
but
also use machine translation to create that non humanized baseline for what someone has said,
mhm.
right? And that kind of becomes a problem too, because you're not really looking at it accurately, but you're removing the personality or the vocalization from it
Yeah.
sometimes, right? So people will treat machine translation as a literal translation baseline, and people very openly want literal translations for things, right? And I'm not going to say that's necessarily bad or good.
Mhm.
It just kind of goes against my style of doing things personally. Uh, just because like I take probably too much time trying to figure out what certain references are, how to ap- approach a certain work
Yeah.
well, right? I guess I'll give you an example of that. So for Callandscape. I was pretty open about like not being the guy for Callandscape, right? I'm not the translator of choice for Callandscape. I want to be, right? But over the years working on it, I very quickly found out, Bryn, you are not the guy. And that has been very freeing and that has been very like, but it shows that I have more to gain from working, right?
When you say you're not the person, what defines you as not being the person? Is it a skill level? Is it a interest, or is it a specialty? Or
So I would say, oh, I just didn't know how to look it up properly, right?
okay,
And that might tie into, like, my interest and stuff. That might tie into my shortcomings as someone who looks at translation from a Japanese to English
Mm.
pipeline, right? And, it doesn't really exist that easily, right? And it's kind of insulting to the Japanese people working on the game, and it's insulting to the Chinese people being represented in the game to say it exists only on that pipeline, right? And so I was using Google Translate to go, okay, I'm going to have the simplified translations or simplified Chinese spellings of all the names. So I went in and I took all the names and all of the lexicon and I put them into Google Translate and I wrote them all down. And I'm pretty sure I have a tweet that still says, I say this and that about Google Translate, but it's been treating me like a princess now, right? And then I got in touch with someone who was on romhacking.net and they were in the forums from like 2016. This is DK. This is the now co-translator of Gate for a couple of years
Mhm.
now. And this person is the guy, right? I found the guy. He knew he was the guy in 2016, right? And but I had messaged him and went, "Hey, we have the scripts. I've kind of just gone through such and such and such, but obviously I'm still stuck on the names. This isn't my background or anything. I don't have experience in it. Would you be down to kind of look these over and stuff?" And he went, "Sure." And so I was very proud of this document, right? And it's hard to hand someone a 19 entry document, blah 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 blah. It was massive,
Yeah.
right? Just all the names, all the terminologies, all the notes and whatevers. And I was referencing the VR game, I was referencing the base game, I was referencing books and trailers and whatever would have English text in them in different cities and stuff that I was finding as well. And obviously the Google translated like Mandarin, right?
Mhm.
Very important part there because I send that, and then he comes back and he goes, "By the way, they speak Cantonese in Hong Kong. They don't use the Mandarin dialect."
Yeah.
So everything I did was wrong by default, right? And that was just it's a very basic thing you could look up if you look up literally anything about Hong Kong,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
I've been in a professional
And
setting and where that was a problem once. So where it was like, oh, we made
mhm,
some assumptions about being in China when Hong Kong's a very different thing. So
right. So it's just like, okay, well, that was my shortcoming as a
yeah,
researcher. That was my shortcoming, even though I was just preparing the document, and I would never want to proceed with it if I didn't have a human look at
yeah,
it, right? There are certain shortcomings that I alone made in my impressions of how the job flow was supposed to work,
yeah.
right? And so I misunderstood my own assignment there. And so some of that is just like, okay, well, why wasn't I interested enough to look into that, right? And it's because I kind of sat on this as a Japanese to English translated game,
Yeah.
right? And I must have on some like microaggressive level looked at like the actual setting as addressing, right? Otherwise, I could have gone as far as to just Google, okay, what's the dialect spoken in Hong Kong? And is that quote simplified Chinese or quote traditional Chinese? And how do those relate with each other?
Well,
Right.
sometimes I think it's hard to know those questions until someone presents it to you, right? I mean, like like to me from the
Right.
outside, when I look at this, like when you say that, like it is okay, you sent it to this person and they knew this, and like to me that seems perfectly fine, right? Like nothing about what you did seemed wrong in this situation to me, at least. I don't know if
Mhm.
that's how it's coming off to you, but
So I don't think that I did like a cardinal sin,
yeah.
but I could not have been the first person to make that mistake. And at which point you kind of ask, why does this mistake get made?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's where
And
feedback
so I
comes in,
think,
right? And to some extent. Yeah.
right. And so DK gave feedback, but I was like, hey, DK, if you're still interested in Skate, do you want to be on it?
Yeah.
Yes. Right. And so we have been buddies about that since. And that's been a very big, like, change for me.
Mhm.
Right. Because I did Planet Laika, and that was a translation based on a script by the same writer. And in a lot of ways, it is at its core the same
Yeah.
game. And they were designed that way. It was designed to be a spirit game. Planet Laika and Skate are both the same game while being very, very different, right? The stories are different, the settings are different, but the themes, the concepts, and stuff are interacting in the same ways.
Yeah.
And I had a much easier time with Planet Laika because I knew how to look certain things up,
Yeah.
right? And I had asked those questions for myself. I'm like, okay, so what would this place be referencing as a location, right? Like once you learn that something might be a reference, you know how to look things up a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But those were just going over my head for Skate. So I could play Skate multiple times and still not know what the fuck I'm
Yeah.
doing, right? Not in a gameplay sense, but just understanding that where I am in the world setting, why things are happening, what's being referenced here. As soon as you like reference like Chinese modern literature, a lot of people might fall off,
Yeah.
right? But DK is like, hey, like this is what we could be looking at, and DK would like send me book references and stuff, and so we were able to kind of pinpoint certain solutions ourselves together,
Yeah.
right? And but then you go, okay, well, if this was so hard for me, why was it so easy for this person? And it's because that person kind of like knew what to look, this person knew what to ask, right? So I'm glad that I learned what to ask, where to look for certain things, what could be asked, right?
Yeah.
Because at the start of Callan's Gate, I was not the guy to go anywhere near Callan's Gate, right? But I was able to kind of get that chance with people and make those mistakes and stuff like that and get corrected. Like getting corrected is one of my favorite
Yeah.
things, right? But I have to remember, yeah, it's a big burden on other people. And I think that people use something like machine translation to remove the burden on others. I do think that machine translation, typically in its use, comes from a point of consideration than it does for like glory stealing, right? Of course, there are people that do it, right? But I don't think that necessarily the use and the reasons behind the use of machine translation are inherently
Yeah.
evil, right?
I mean, part of the reason why I
Um,
did like kind of do a recent stint of trying to learn some more Japanese, how successful that's been is a whole other thing, but
mhm,
like was because I was trying to communicate with someone about something I've researched and never actually put something together. I got to put it together at some point someday. It's for the PCFX fan club. But like
mm,
I had to rely on somebody else to write that message for me, and I felt really bad about having to rely on them. But I knew that like I needed it done right. Like my personal podcast, whatever. Who gives a crap? Like at the end of the day, if I get something wrong when I'm like talking to 5 people about Love and Berry, who cares? But like when it comes to communicating with somebody in Japanese, I think that's like a fear of mine to some extent of like if I if I'm trying to do something a little bit more formal and a little bit more research oriented, right? Like I'm trying to do something right. Maybe that's what I'm
mhm,
saying. Like whatever I'm doing needs to be correct because I'm doing a research thing on this. So like it can't be this kind of willy nilly kind of thing, to some extent. Um,
mm. Well, I think it's like a due
yeah,
politeness, right? Like if you're writing a message to someone, you want to at least like double check it before you send it, even in
yeah.
English. If I'm writing a message to someone and I'm trying to be kind, the least I can do is give it a secondary
Don't
glance,
don't
right?
read like all my Discord messages are just like the hottest trash of text I send people, but
I will live with your text messages and I will live with your DMs if you send me less than 12 at a time.
I love pressing
But no,
enter
I'm
all
the
the
same
time when
way.
I message people. So
So, but like a formal email, like if
yeah,
this leaves the DMs can just do what the DMs got to do. They are a function. But when it comes to emailing, when it comes to writing, right?
yeah,
You usually just give it another glance, right? And I think that there is something to be said about how highly someone looks at another language and its functions and its needs
mhm,
and does not double check those things before presenting them to another
yeah.
audience, right? And so, do I think that some people actually put Japanese way lower in their level of importance or priority and stuff when representing it? Yes. So, like when some people are just like, I don't actually care what it says in Japanese, but I'm going to have it say this, and I'm going to say that it says this. And I think that that's why I went to localization first, is because there's a certain level of impulsion
Yeah.
that drives localizers and unlocalizers, right? Like we're all very impulsively reacting towards one
Yeah.
another, right? And I think that's why I get so immediately wary about being asked questions about my thoughts on literal translations or not,
Yeah.
right? Because a lot of times when you hear that question from people, and I just say, well, the text is there for a reason, they don't necessarily like that, right? Because they're looking for something to kind of write over as well, right? And that's just a gripe that I have with people that focus on localization over translation. But I also don't necessarily like translators over localizers either. I just don't think that there's any win when you're not willing to cooperate with the other, right? So I don't think that certain games could be touched without a localizer, right? But at the same time, um, hmm, you don't really want someone coming in and doing a very Japanese work like Boku and over localizing it, right? I guess I'm going to go into Boku for an example because you would run into a lot of conversation on what people would do with Boku before actually doing it, right? And usually it comes down to the translation of Boku, the name itself, right? Boku is a name. Boku is the little boy's name, right? And it is spoken aloud at the end of the first game, I believe, in the FMV, right? You can run into people that go, "Oh, I can translate Boku da 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 da," and they would be great by the text, but they don't know that Boku is his name, and so they will come up with some way to prematurely localize the name Boku,
The way
right?
I've always heard it localized is
And
my
say,
summer vacation, but it sounds like what you're saying here is that
right,
that is not accurate. So,
depending on who you're asking, it is not accurate, right?
and it could be both
Um,
in some ways, I guess, like because
could be, but
yeah,
you are sacrificing one version of
yeah,
Boku, right? And people do that without really openly entertaining that Boku is his
yeah,
name. And some people will try and come up with names in game to replace the character names, right? And they will try and like there are drafts that people have seen, that people have shared, where the name Boku is translated as my or me or something else, right?
yeah.
Where it applies. If it's a filler thing, people will prematurely do that. And I think that because no one asks what if Boku is name, you run into what would the name be by erasing Boku without asking if Boku is his name,
Yeah.
right? And the fact that that question doesn't get asked openly enough, I think is kind of it's like you're missing the big thing, right? You're missing what dialect is spoken in Hong Kong, right?
Yeah.
Why didn't you look this up? So, because if you look it up, it's very easy. It's right there, right? But then it's like, why isn't it talked about? If everyone has his opinion on how it could be done and ideas for how Boku could be done, and then no one says, wait, Boku is his name, so it would be Boku's summer vacation. Why is that option never listed by anyone, right?
I run into this problem with like trying to get people to think more critically about games and things like that. But like, what do you think are the questions you have to ask yourself to identify those moments where you don't even know what you need to look into?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess for me, like what is the statement? The last one to find out about the fish bowl is the fish, right?
Never heard of it, but I'll believe you.
All right, I think it's an actual statement. If not, I fever dreamed
It
something.
might, maybe
But
it's
like
regional.
the last, maybe it's regional. Maybe I read it on like some I don't know Hallmark birthday card or
Yeah, yeah,
something.
yeah.
But I always think of that when I'm in this situation. It's like, okay, well, I didn't know about the fishbowl, right? That doesn't mean that the fishbowl ain't there, and that doesn't mean I'm not a fish. But I didn't it didn't register yet. But like I think it's fine to be a late bloomer. I think it's fine to say, hey, listen, like I wasn't the guy to be making these statements, coming to these conclusions, So like that's where I kind of just take it as a shortcoming on my part, right? Especially if I want to look at localization as like an art form or a craft,
Yeah.
right? Like you have to be like serious about that. I don't know how we can talk about video games as an art form that needs to be curated, that needs to be studied and appreciated the way that other high level art is, and then say that that can be entirely secondary,
Yeah.
right? Because you wouldn't run into these translation issues and stuff when talking about like a textbook description of certain work, right? I do think that deep down, I would be fascinated to read about localization discourse between like ancient art historians and stuff, or um, ancient Japanese or ancient European art historians and stuff. Because I'm sure there are some stories there about how certain names would be localized, kind of like when people run into translations of the Bible
Yeah.
and how those always have debacles and stuff to them. Um, so I do think that this is par for the course that we run into these conversations and stuff. It would be a problem if we didn't by now. But I don't know. I think that there's a certain fascination, I think, with like Japanese culture that kind of makes it run into this Orientalism where things have to look a certain way to maintain this Orientalist image of them.
Does that apply to like it basically it sounds like when there is an expectation of something looking a certain way, can that like pervert the ability to translate it appropriately? Does that question make sense?
I think you can run into it depending on the game,
Hmm.
right? I think just since you said pervert, I guess I could
Sorry,
say
sometimes I use words
people
like
respond.
pervert and stuff when I like it probably doesn't need to be pervert, but here I
No,
am.
I was thinking of Oremo. I was thinking of Oremo, where a lot of English fans still refer to the anime title as Oremo. But you'll accept My Little Sister Can't Be This Cute,
Yeah.
right? And people don't really seem to have a problem with that, right? So I do think that when people do come up with a problem with it, it's kind of more selective.
Mm.
Like for me, it's like if there's a game title that has to be changed, or a location that has to be changed, or a name or a feature or a function in a game that has to be changed, 99% of the time it's for space. Like I think that if you can come up with something shorter, awesome, right? Um but I was very terrified at a point in Linda because in the menu for the items, you have the full animal name next to the full tier or the full equipment name, right? And Risu takes up 2 character spaces, but Squirrel takes up like 7, 9, somewhere in there. And so it's like you have these different conversations with yourself about the fonts and the space and stuff and the technical whatevers. Planet Laika, we could not have actual text for the location headers at all because the text was too long. But they kind of had to be the names that they were, right? But there is one fountain there's a plaza in the game that I had to change the name of because if I had to make a Soviet reference, it would be the Plaza of People's Friendships off the Fountain of People's
Mm.
Friendships. That wasn't fucking fitting in no damn header in that game, right? Image or not. It was just not. So we went with like Amity Plaza. And Pliskin, who was working on the Russian translation of the game, was like, why is this Amity Plaza? And I was like, okay, I promise you, I was looking at this fountain and I knew it wasn't going to
Yeah.
fit. Right. And they went, okay, that's actually very fair. Because Mr. Nobody had to go in and make images, and and Esper had to reload all of the location headers to show images instead of text because the text wasn't working. They were extremely limited, and they were just going to stay limited because of how they like buffered into the game or whatever. So, but the Plaza of People's Friendships would be the correct English translation to go with that, right? Um, or unless you wanted the Fountain of Friendship of Peoples, right?
Yeah. I was gonna say like
Being the
friendship
base
fountain,
reference.
but that doesn't sound good. So
It still sounds like I'm missing the reference,
yeah.
right? Like if there is a reference with an English canon, I should stick with the English canon as much as I can. Otherwise, I might as well make something up anyway. In which case, I'm going to pick the one that fits.
When you get complaints about stuff like that, like how often is it? I guess maybe how often is a good question, but like, does it happen more often than not that that sometimes somebody complains about something? It's just like, sorry, it's not like, yes, like the thing you're telling me is probably right, but because of some limitation of the game, like we couldn't actually do it that way. Or is that like kind of an edge case that you just told me?
So, um, no, I think that's a good question. And I think that was a good case to kind of bring up
Yeah.
because, well, Pliskin is a hacker in his own right, right? He's skilled. He has his own portfolio. I think it would be great to get to work with him at some point, right? So I was pretty excited at the notion that he was interested in doing a like Russian translation of Planet
Mhm.
Laika, because there is at least one like several hour video about Planet Laika in Russian, um, just explaining the game from the English translation to a Russian audience, and it gets a lot of engagement, right? And so I'm happy like at the notion that he wanted to do that and he was going through it so critically, right? I love when my stuff gets corrected and redlined. It is part of my concept in my like WordPress blog. It's like, but no one ever takes me up on it,
Yeah.
right? No one really takes me up on like, hey, what does this say versus such and such and such, right? And they don't pinpoint lines and go, oh, what's going on here, right? And why did you change this? Or like, was this a change or why did you adjust this? Pliskin was willing to go in and ask those questions for me when working on his own
Yeah.
patch. So, like, I was extremely joyed to get that because that's what I want, right? I'm not posting this stuff online to have just, oh, it's nice and then move on,
Yeah.
right? I'm happy that people get to play it, right? But at the same time, it's like it doesn't necessarily help me if I'm going and doing something wrong 80 times in a row, right? Or like, hey, I think I would do this a little bit differently. And that's why I spend so much time looking at like there is a little bit of ego searching into it, right? But I also look up what people say about it and I'm very like I will write down criticisms. I will write down if I see typos and things like that. Whether they get fixed and stuff right away is usually kind of up to Esper, right? But just because Esper is so busy, I'm not going to bug her. But like I do take that to heart, and it does make my work better by the next game.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope. Like I write down everything. I write down everything that I'm having trouble reading. I'm writing down things that I'm having a good time reading. Or if I have like a token thought of, oh, it would be interesting to write a character this way, or it would be interesting to like translate this line this way
Yeah.
at some point. That doesn't mean I'm guaranteed to use it in the next thing that I work on, but if I run into certain stars aligning,
Mm.
sure. Um like when people are just talking about like Shogunai being translated to it can't be helped,
Mm.
right? There are certain iterations in certain contexts where that might actually be the more like natural response than other versions of Shogunai, right? So I think that you're kind of missing out if you just write off something as like a bad translation just because it's used a lot. Because it's used a lot in the wrong setting and situations and stuff before, but sometimes it's got to be the best version. So even a broken clock is right twice, right? So, I don't know. I guess there's just not really anything that I'm like damned for or damned against.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, one of the biggest problems that I feel like you can have if nobody cares about what you're doing is like no
Yeah,
feedback. And I think to some
no
extent,
feedback.
when it comes to, I could be wrong on this, but like when it comes to fan translations, I'm guessing people aren't going to look at it deeply until it's ready to be played, probably, right? Like, so if you post up like the script work you've been doing and say, can I get some feedback on this? Unless you're like really targeting like a very specific audience or reaching like a specific person, I don't know how you get that feedback as easily without like in the case with like, sorry, I don't remember the name directly, but like DK, I think is what you said, like specifically going and
Talon's
asking.
Gate with
Yeah,
DK.
yeah, specifically going after them and
Yeah,
asking that. So like, I don't know how you do that without like creating a space of peers almost to do that, right? Like a space of peers where
right.
they're willing to do that with you in some ways. Um,
Right. I think that that's been the advantage to the Eight Mansions Discord, and I think that's why I'm so like attached to that Discord, even if I'm just in lurker mode right now.
yeah,
It's because like there are some people there that I will bug, and like I try to keep it as like scratch back, as possible.
yeah,
But like sometimes like like oh this person would be the person to ask, right? Or this person would be the person to ask, right? Like there are certain things I wouldn't ask Arya, but there are certain things that she would probably be the first person I asked,
yeah,
right? Like she's very skilled at audio and she can give me a second opinion. But if I was looking for something like say a historical reference, maybe I would ask DK,
yeah,
right? Or if I was asking for a net slaying sort of thing, maybe I would go straight back to Arya,
yeah,
right? Um, it really just kind of depends as you talk with people and socialize more. Like you kind of know what people's interests are,
yeah,
right? If I wanted VTuber advice, I would ask DK again, right?
yeah,
Um, so there are certain intersections, and then they each have their own little like neighborhoods and cul-de-sacs to touch base with,
yeah.
right? And I probably have like some advantage somewhere that I'm worth DMing over. Maybe not all the time though. Arya had asked me for grammar advice recently. I'm like, were you kidnapped? But I was like, blink twice if you're okay, Arya.
Well, I think what you've told me before is that you feel like you're more of a generalist, right? Where it's like you don't have like a specific
Mhm.
specialty, but you have enough knowledge in all these segments where you can kind of be the bridge, I feel like, in those situations. I think that's usually the goal of like a generalist is to somehow connect the pieces of specialists that might not necessarily interact with each other otherwise to some extent. Um, and some of that is also like putting on a hat that, maybe a project just needs somebody who can at least try to do this, right? But
Right.
like to me, that's what you've always read to me is like somebody who kind of is a good baseline to connect people within a project. I don't work with you on projects, so I don't know, right? Like
Mhm.
I've done play testing, which like what does that really do, right? I mean, it's important, but like at the same time, it's like a kind of like the last part of a process to some extent, right? Um,
Mhm.
so like to me, that's what it feels like your role often feels like in those situations. But with fan translations, it sounds like you need to be adaptable, right? Like in being willing to play these different roles. If you're going to tackle like your own projects, at least I feel like.
Right. No, I'll agree with all of that.
Yeah.
I do tend to think of myself as like that, like jack of all trades in some
Yeah.
way, right? Like if there's programming stuff, I might not do the programming, but I kind of understand what might be explained, and I might know someone. Like if I see the word VWF a lot, I'm like, oh, I know someone to bug about VWF stuff. Esper doesn't shut the fuck up about
Yeah.
that, right? So like I could ask her like, hey, like, is this something you'd be interested to work on, or can you point me in a direction of someone that you might know is more specific with this console or this series or something? So in that way, I very much am a squeaky wheel. I get myself into a lot of trouble just from being a squeaky
Yeah.
wheel.
I think that is part of, like, when you're a generalist, that's also part of the like need, is like being knowing where your limitations are to some extent too, right? Like, because
Mhm.
if you put yourself in a position that a specialist needs to be in, you're gonna kind of bog things down to some extent. So
But I do think that's why it pays to do things yourself and kind of know what goes into
yeah,
it,
yeah,
right? Kind of going back into the machine translation thing, right? Like that's the biggest thing that you kind of lose, is that you lose a lot of like your ability to be corrected. You lose a lot of your ability to be, because if someone just says, "Oh, it's machine translated," like you don't really get anything out of
yeah.
that. You're going to get way more out of it if you spent like 18 minutes just bitching over this line and going, "What the fuck is this?" and giving up. Because then you know how it's broken down, maybe, or you have parts of the string that you don't like. String being the Japanese sentence, right? Right? There might just be like one, like, what does the O mean in front of this noun here versus blah, 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 right? Like, why is this different?
Yeah.
If it's not clicking, if you get mad at something for 5 minutes and someone corrects it really easily, you will never forget it. You will be so mad about it. And you will just sit on and go like, oh my gosh, it was fucking Osaka. Or like you misheard this word or something in a song and you go, it's dorama. Like, oh, right.
Mhm.
And like for me, so I'm actually really bad at audio. It's one of my like weak spots, right? And I don't want it to be a weak spot, but I let it be a weak spot for way too long. So now when I'm trying to make out something, I would be like spending days on it. I'm like so mad. I'm like,
Yeah.
right? And I'll be like, but by that point, I have a document, I have a list of what I think certain things are, and I go, hey, do you mind taking a peek at this? And just correcting it. These are what I think this is. This is such and such. And I might get like no corrections or no feedback. Oh, like I don't know what this bitch is saying either. Or you'll get a steam clean and you'll be like, oh, it's aggravating, but like so relieving, right? There is something like, I think it's just what edging is like. As someone that doesn't know any of that, that has to be what it's like. It's like, whoa, it's
Gotcha.
such a feeling. Good for this. The lyric is done, right? It feels good. And that's not, you're robbing yourself of that, right? By like machine
Yeah.
translation.
Well, I guess like in that
So,
sense, like that's, so when I was talking about machine translation earlier, I think I was definitely talking about more like a casual user perspective, right? Like as someone, like almost an
mhm,
end user in my case, like I played through all of Buddy Mission Bond with machine translation, right? That's its own thing, and then there's the ups and downs of that, right?
right.
But
But you know those ups and downs because you know Buddy Bond fight, right?
yeah, but
So, like, you know that there's going to be stuff you're missing out
yeah,
on,
yeah. Like
right?
I always
So,
say, like 70% maybe is correct. Like I will always be willing to be proven wrong. I did get like some validation from like the Japanese community being like, "Oh yeah, that was a good video," but the snake eating its own tail is that I'm almost certain they machine translated my video back to Japanese.
no,
And I'm just like,
guaranteed,
oh
right?
man, like that's, I'm sure that's a nightmare. But yeah. But I
Mhm,
guess one thing so one thing that I see a lot these days, and I don't know, maybe this has always been around, but it's just a lot more apparent now. People are like drawing more attention to it. Is like translations
mhm,
that are being put out with machine translation as like the primary thing. I'm playing through Shining Blade right now. I don't know the story of what
mhm.
happened with it, but at the end of the day, it seems like at some point someone took a script that seemed pretty incomplete and then just basically machine translated everything that was left and then kind of dumped it out there. And I'm curious, what do you, I don't want to put words in your mouth with this stuff, but like to me that feels like a situation that could do harm. So I feel like, do you feel like those kind of releases do harm? And like what do you think is to what can you respect with those releases, and then like what can you criticize, and like what do you think about like the health of like fan translations even surrounding just a single game because of that? So there's a lot of words,
So I
but
feel like right. I guess I didn't know the full history of the Shining Blade translation. If there was a human translator involved and their work was used, and then it was added with machine translation and released, I think going in and finding out, oh, here's this person's translation and stuff, the whole thing's fucking bad, lol, would be a sting, right? Especially if it was a situation where, like, maybe they could be brought back, or maybe they could have their blessing signed off to go find another human to help fill in the blanks or rewrite
and
it.
maybe I don't necessarily want to get
Um,
too specific into Shining Blade. It's just
yeah,
what's on my mind right now. I think I'm just talking about the general concept of this kind of thing as a whole.
right. Well, I'm kind of talking about maintaining like the humanism in
Yeah,
it, I guess, right? If there are people that worked on it, I do think that they get some dignity and some say on where their work
yeah.
goes, right? This kind of ties into the Princess Crown thing a little bit. Because like that wasn't a draft that Sam I Am was happy with, right? And the hack wasn't a draft that Cyber Warrior X was happy with, right? So if their work is going to go into it at all, and now it's out and people say, LOL, it's bad, right? Like at that point, now people are still looking at Cyber Warrior X and Sam I Am and going, hey, well, what the fuck, right? And they're like, well, what the fuck us? Like we didn't know. And so because it was like used outside of their like
Yeah.
means, the elements of the Princess Crown hack. So when you are just kind of tossing it into a compiler and releasing it and going to duh, like you might have something playable for 8 minutes, right?
Mhm.
So in that end, like I do think that there is a certain like correlation with machine translation in which you're just kind of like churning something together, spitting it out for the sake of having something to spit out.
So it's kind of like the other side of that coin, where like it is
Mhm.
the, the translation's what's being sacrificed here.
Those people's works were kind of used and taken out of their own context,
Hmm.
right? And that's kind of like where the risks of machine I think it just adds a more tangible example of the risks tied into machine
Yeah.
translation. Because you're kind of doing the same thing, right? If I said something and I put it on the internet, and then you machine translated it and then you posted it in a video, right? Um, I didn't really get a say in how that looked,
Yeah.
right? And so when it's something like fiction or when it's something like personal use, I think that that's relatively okay, right? In your video, in your buddy on fight
Buddy
video,
on
you're
fight,
not
buddy
necessarily
mission
sure.
bond.
Buddy Mission Bond. I'm sorry. I know. Like I'll have to play the game. I haven't. I like the art. But all I can really know is just, oh, Ben likes this one, and then I kind of move
I
on.
do like it,
Right?
but I like the caveat I always give is that like I did not actually read it, right? Like I'm making I've called it an
That's
interpretation
fine.
is what I call it now. It's like my interpretation of what was happening. So, and there's other games that I've done without machine translation with very similar things as well. Um,
But that's what people are watching your YouTube for. Like, I don't think that Japanese users were hopping on and being like, I'm a fan of this game that came out here.
mhm,
And they're hopping on YouTube to watch some like foreigner play it so they could cop on the story. I don't think that that's really
yeah,
happening, right? I think they specifically wanted to hop on and see what this person's impressions
yeah,
were. So I still think that your video was about your impressions and your video was still about
yeah,
you playing the game, right? And I think that's how it is with like any streamer, right? Even if like certain streamers have permission to play a game to completion, the people who watch that streamer are there to watch that
yeah.
streamer. They're not necessarily there just to steal the story from Persona, especially when people who want to steal the story from Persona don't want someone fucking talking in the background anyway, right? They're like,
No commentary playthroughs,
just,
please.
yeah. So, like, and some people will go to them specifically for that, right? Um, so I do think that there are advantages to it versus not, like on a YouTube format versus, like, I do think though that people weren't necessarily going there because of the machine
Yeah,
translation, right? The way that English players might. And so you have people watching your videos for different reasons, right? And that might also kind of tie into how risky it is to quote people, right? Like if people who are fans of a certain VTuber, like let's say Aqua, right, who had recently graduated, if someone is making clickbaity posts to make someone sound more lewd than they were originally,
mhm,
for clickbait, to get more people interested in watching Aqua, does it really help Aqua if you're misquoting her to sound lewd to get a new audience,
yeah.
right? Even if it's a new audience, even if it's numbers and engagement and stuff, like, where does Aqua get a say in how she's presented to overseas fans
Yeah.
when she's being misquoted, even if she's getting more engagement and more of a fan base out of it in the long run? Because someone wanted to make a clip and they wanted to make her sound
Yeah.
extreme,
Yeah.
right? And so that's what kind of runs into the Sakurai quotes, the Ghibli misquotes from Miyazaki, like the "I hate anime," or like he gets so misquoted all of the time, right?
And in some ways
And
that's like made him even more like infamous in the West,
endearing.
right? Yeah, yeah.
It's endearing him as this grandpa character and
Yeah.
stuff, right?
Even though it's not
And then, but
accurate,
at
or
the
at
same
least not
time,
directly accurate kind of thing. So
right. And for someone that has kind of said, like, oh, this is an insult to life itself,
yeah.
right? If we're going to speak on quoting Miyazaki in English, right? I've already criticized quoting Miyazaki in English, but to do that
Yeah.
as a double down for someone that had a very strong reaction to AI use as an insult to humanity itself, quote unquote,
Yeah.
unquote, unquote, unquote. Where does that tie in with his humanity for saying the line?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that there are inherent risks to machine translation, right? Because if you cannot look at the text that is there, then you cannot really speak on it,
Mhm.
right? That's like judging a game for an extended period of time and showing a clip or something while having never played the game yourself,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not saying you cannot do that, right? But obviously there are risks to that, right? It's like if you're posting Mein Kampf and go, "This is a pretty neat book for existing," and you never really elaborate on it because you never actually read it.
Yeah.
You just know it's a notorious book, right? Like, there are inherent risks to that,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I think that when you're posting any quote by somebody, like, it's the same thing too, especially when you're in partnerships with people, especially when you're trying to represent somebody else, right? Especially if you're letting someone say something outlandish on purpose for your engagement. It's like letting your friend walk into a job interview with their, like, pants
Yeah.
down. You wouldn't really do that if you cared about your friend walking into a job interview,
Yeah.
right? So, if they don't know it, but you do, like, you have a certain responsibility to, like, help make someone leave with as much dignity as they had walking in, right?
You mentioned earlier, like kind of a literal translation versus a localization, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I think there's obviously going to be like a range of things on that in terms of where you can fall. But like, what do you view as your role in that situation? Um, like maybe not even using those terms directly, but like, what do you think is, because you're essentially taking somebody else's work and communicating it to somebody else, right? Like,
Mhm.
what do you view as kind of your role in that situation and your responsibilities in that?
So, since I'm quoting, like, typically when I'm working on, translation stuff, it's fictitious material, and it's usually just fictional writing by an author,
Yeah.
right?
Well, they're still trying to tell
I
a
can't say
story,
that that's
right?
second.
They're still
Right.
communicating what they have, like a value set they're communicating through their story and stuff like that, right? Like, I think everybody puts a little bit of themselves and what they want the world to look like through their works, right?
Right. Well, the text is there for a
Yeah.
reason, right? Now, as far as what I typically look at it, right? My first step is just, okay, this writing is an extension of the author themselves,
Hmm.
right? And even if I know that someone is just writing something to just write something, right? Like, certain writers have ghostwriters, right? So not every single word in a Shoji Masuda script was written by Shoji
Yeah.
Masuda, right? Just to not every word in a Shigeru Miyamoto interview was written by Shigeru Miyamoto, right?
Yeah.
Or like YouTube videos, right? They have writers, John Oliver, blah blah blah. They all have writers,
Yeah.
right?
And video games are like huge,
So
complicated machines of games being made, right? So like everybody has to step
it is
in.
a red
Yeah.
tape thing, right? And but they also have their lore and stuff like that. So even if someone had written Final Fantasy VII the first time, if they come back in and read Final Fantasy VII and choose to write it again, like say for Rebirth,
Mhm.
there are other rules that have been added to the Final Fantasy VII canon. That even if you wrote the first Final Fantasy VII, you probably have to follow those rules now
Mhm.
when exploring Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? The writer of Final Fantasy had to look up Final Fantasy to write Final Fantasy again, even if it was the same story,
Mhm.
right? I guarantee you, right? Like, I'm sure, like, even Nomura with Kingdom Hearts, I'm sure that someone had to remind him of certain things that could go on in Kingdom Hearts, even if he, like, cooked it up, right? Like, listen, there are rules now, since we did this, this, and this, right? And that would be an editor's position, right? So they also have an editor that they have to confront, right? So there was a lot of work that it went into it. And so, like, there are certain things that I try and keep in mind is that this is still going to be a work that's personal to them, but I'm not going to treat it like it's their firstborn,
Mhm.
right? The same way I'm not going to treat it like it's their thirdborn. Um, just because, like, I can't go into it with that kind of bias, right? But I can go in, I can research what it's about. I can research interviews from them, right? If I can't find interviews, though, I should still try and do as good of a job as I can as if I did have the interviews,
Yeah.
right? They're only there to help. They're not really there to replace my work, if that makes sense. But I have to like look up the lore. I have to look up the setting. Like when you have something like your retro futuristic Soviet space dogs, right? I need to be looking up Russian art history. I need to be looking up Russian Soviet history. I need to be looking up Japanese art history, modern literature, blah, 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 and see where those things marry into each other,
Mhm.
right? I'm probably not going to have to look up like American YouTuber pop culture references, right? Like I can cross off certain things from my list of things that I have to be open to writing about, right? Until I see it and then I'm proven
Yeah.
wrong, right? Like Napple, I have to look up Mother Goose. I have to look up Lewis Carroll. I have to be able to write nonsense poems kind of on my own. I have to be able to write Mother Goose poems on my own,
Mhm.
right? Otherwise, I don't think I could faithfully adapt some of the things that they're doing, right? I have to know how those structures, those pentameters all work on some level, right? Even if it was a student level, those were conclusions that I had come to in looking at the text, right? Um, like if a character has a specific pentameter or a specific rhyme scheme, I need to be able to adapt that in a way that works in English,
Mhm.
right? Japanese Mary Had a Little Lamb or Japanese London Bridge is Falling Down does not match English London Bridge is Falling Down or English Mary Had a Little Lamb. They have their own syllabary they had to dance around. They have their own like terminologies and stuff. I have been watching the Japanese Pokemon Kids TV channel, which is essentially Japanese Coco Melon with Pokemon on it. And it's been a lot of fun, like listening to some of the songs as they kind of translate back and forth. And be like, oh, this is very strange. This is very different because they'll kind of make up little happenings in some of the songs as they go. But that's something you kind of have to do to make the song work,
Yeah.
right? If you can't adapt the fact that it's a song, no one's going to give a fuck what it says. At that point, the isn't even relevant,
Yeah.
right? And I had kind of said that about Princess Crown too. It's like if you can't even translate the fact that it is a video game that is played from start to finish, you did not translate the text or anything else in it.
Yeah.
You didn't even translate the fact that it was a game. And I think the same applies to music. I think I quote this on myself all of the time. So those are like the first thing is just, even when you're studying kanji or kana, they say, you know what? Don't just study the kana, study the kanji. Don't just study the kanji, study the words. Don't just study the words, study the grammar, right? It all expands, right? Like studying Japanese is just this matryoshka doll or whatever, where you just have to go into the layers and stuff and translate the whole doll.
Yeah.
And I tend to kind of go at these projects with that sort of logic. I have to know what I'm translating, in which case I already know what I'm sacrificing. If I have, like, let's say I'm adapting a TV opening song, right? If the lyrics go really fast and it has like a really fast syllable count, there's a good chance I'm not going to retain all of the original text. Like, that's the first thing that I know is going. Is a lot of the original literal translations for things will not make it into the game. And if they do, I am cutting out half of the content to make the first content fit, in which case I have to prioritize what goes
Yeah.
in. And so I think that games are kind of the same way. Like you have to know the technical limitations. Sometimes I won't touch certain parts of the translation until I know the technical limitations. That way I just don't set myself up for either a huge edit later or like we just explode the game, right? So I'm touching on one game now, which is an RPG, but it has a Lagaya based move expansion, or kind of like Xenogears or Legaia, where it's like you hit button combos to like progress the
Yeah.
attacks. And right now I just have like initials in, and I would never just have the initials in with no context, but like right now I need to. That way we know what they are when they show up, right? So I haven't even entertained it from that translation standpoint yet, but it's because it's a game first. I have to let it be a game first and play through, and we can see what it is as it shows up.
Yeah.
Um, so sometimes that just affects my work schedule, right? But a lot of times I'm just researching things. I might be reading books on it. Like if someone says, "Hey, read Romance of the Three Kingdoms," I will sit down and I will read Romance of the Three Kingdoms, right? And then I just kind of like binge that, right? So even if I'm doing video game stuff, I'm kind of doing anything but video games at that point. And it might help on like 30 other projects, right? Like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a completely different book if you have no idea what the fuck history of American rock and roll music is, right? You don't know what the fuck anyone's names are. You're like, "Oh, this is great," you know? But when you know music and you know like American rock and roll history and stuff, it's a very different comic. So,
Yeah, I was gonna say
I
that,
think
like,
that
in some ways, I don't know if this is like a good or a bad thing about me. I often will pride myself in my ignorance of certain things and exposing myself to it. Like,
Mhm.
with the Wizard of Oz DS game being like, I'm not gonna watch Wizard of Oz. I've never watched Wizard of Oz. I'm just gonna play the DS game and just like enjoy that experience. And like in some ways, it is just like I think that's more interesting to me than just like directly knowing what coming in informed, right? One of the most fascinating things
Mhm.
my friend said to me is like he's gonna watch the first episode of One Piece and the last episode of One Piece, and like that's the only One Piece he'll ever watch, and like I have so much respect for that. But
Mhm.
that's like a weird like personal development thing that I think is like very specific to me. But I think
Mhm.
when you have in your case, like when I make videos, it's a very personal thing. I try to maybe I think I have really moved away from like the informative video because I feel like anybody else can do that and anybody else can do it better than me, right? Because I don't have a lot of cultural
Mhm.
understanding of a lot of things because I don't really watch movies or
Mhm.
read books or any of that stuff. But it sounds like what you're
Mhm.
saying through translation, like in some ways it is almost like this lightning pole to like let you engage with other media and expose you to a lot of different types of media and stuff like that. Um, and I don't know if that is like a benefit of it that you kind of recognize or if that is just like a workload thing in your mind.
It's probably
Yeah.
both, right? Like I don't hang out and watch movies. Like I might have thoughts on things like Tarantino movies and stuff. I could be like, yeah, it's such and such and such,
Yeah.
right? But unless someone just makes a game about Tarantino movies, that's not really useful for that.
Hmm.
However, I'm thinking about people who like translate within the scope of like anime rom-coms,
Hmm.
right? Like My Little Sister Can't Be This Cute. Anything in that genre. Like like anime little sister genre. If you translate one, you could probably translate the other ones in that genre by different authors and stuff well and faithfully, right? And if they have different like they talk about math a lot or they talk about the Jinchi culture a lot, you kind of know when they're being spoken of and breaking outside of the normal rules of that genre, right? And you can look into them and like learn a little bit more about the Jinchi culture from there. You can learn a little bit more about math from there. You can learn a little bit like Bakemonogatari, right? Like you can look into different word stems and grammar tricks and just once you know how Bakemonogatari like splits up from the rest of the genre, like you already know exactly what you need to be looking up, right? Whereas something like Mawaru Penguin Drum is a little bit more of just like a mixed bag, even by like shoujo anime standards. So you might not necessarily know when a reference is being played out. Even so it does depend on the work. And then I
To
think
be
that
clear, like I don't know either of these animes, so I don't know if this point's kind of getting
these
to
are in,
me.
yeah.
Yeah, like I don't really know if I know what when you use those as examples, I don't know what exactly you're referring to in this situation.
Right. Maybe I'll zero in for games then. I'm going to say maybe if you translate one Dragon Quest, you can translate any game that looks like Dragon Quest, right?
Mm. Okay.
And then if someone shows up and they start talking about insects or something, right? And then you realize, oh, I guess I'm actually translating Jade Cocoon. you know where it's different in the world setting, you understand what is immediately different when you're familiar with that Dragon Quest genre,
Mhm.
right? If you go from Dragon Quest, you can translate Fire Emblem pretty faithfully, right? Um, but then you might run into something like Jade Cocoon, which takes a really big cultural sidestep from that like high fantasy Western knights in armor like zone,
Yeah.
right? And so you might have something else you have to look up. You might have other cultural vocabulary to look up, right? Um, and so whereas something like, let me see, a fighting game might immediately be different, right? Just because if you have to translate Ryu and Ken and Chun Li and Dulcim together, like those names start getting kind of different. So you have different rules, you have different locales that you have to be careful about. And even if it's a much smaller game, there's a chance though that you don't have as much room to make things up as you go along, right?
Mhm.
Like something like Dragon Ball Z might even trip people up because let's say that you could do Fist of the North Star, you could do Saint Seiya, but if you're not really familiar with um like the Chinese culture behind DBZ and Dragon Ball and like Son Goku and Sun Wukong and stuff, you might not know how to go about it
Yeah.
accurately, right? And so you could probably get tripped up on something that is very adamantly for little kids because it's outside of the scope of what you've normally done.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, I've just kind of genre hopped so much. I've kind of run into that bit where it's like I don't necessarily know all of the time when something is being different. I can usually tell when something is dropping a reference, right, to something else. And I could be like, okay, I have the inkling that I need to look something else up first before I continue with this. And that might be the only takeaway that I have, right? And so that's kind of the pains of being a generalist too, is that every time I run into something new like that, I'm kind of back to square
Yeah.
one. Whereas someone that's a bit more specialized in, say, like harem anime, there are certain tropes and things like that, and there are certain writing styles and stuff where they might automatically know how to write in English like a woman that says Desua, right? Like just depending on their different roles,
Yeah.
right? Like if you use Oni-chan versus Big Brother and stuff, right? Like when you're in your genre and when you're in your zone, you have passed that question. You are beyond that in your writing style, right? Whereas someone that's not used to doing harem anime but might run into it the once will suddenly have to ask those questions for the first time again.
Yeah. Do you find that to be an
Um,
enjoyable process? Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at here. Is like, is that something that you enjoy doing, or is it a frustration?
enjoy doing it. I think that it's fun running into how other people approach dialogue too. And so it kind of turns the internet back into that open forum. And just using other people's opinions and using other people's takes on it as a tool. And so, but that's me also breaking it down line by line, word by word,
Mhm.
right? Machine translation kind of robs you a lot of that, right? But if you're going word by word and you're looking these things up, you get that appreciation that like 40 other people have vocalized online at the very least. And like it does kind of get you a little bit like more intimate with the work that you're working on, and so you get more enthused at like certain characters showing up even if they're not necessarily like your trope at first. You understand like what makes that character appealing, right? I think that's kind of the advantage to having your boots on the ground for it.
Yeah. From my perspective, I see most of what you're doing is like fan translation work, right? That is like it is more
Mhm.
personal driven or community driven or however you want to categorize it kind of work, right? And when you're in a
Yeah.
professional position, I think it's to me it seems like there's probably a different set of requirements on you in terms of what do you have the capability to fully research in the way that you need to, right? Because it's like a time limit, right? There's like a literal how much is like money is this worth for me getting to get paid? Like, do you feel like when you move to professional translation, do you lose anything that you enjoy about translation at all, or is it something that is that not really a problem? I guess.
So the two like main things I would think about are the deadline,
Hmm.
right? And then I guess just the customer's needs, right? So I could go ahead and I could give out, hey, this character's name is like this. I think it's based off of this. And here are some examples of it in merchandise and stuff. So obviously they have different things, but ultimately these are the tools that I had to decide that the spelling will be this for the remainder of my document,
Mhm.
right? And meanwhile, I might not have all of those references when going at another character and be like, listen, I do not have this, I do not have this, but I have reason to believe that this character is such and such and such and such and such, based on such and such. If I can do those things when writing it, then I can at least make my case for the document, right? But I also have to go in expecting things to be changed. I think that for me, when I was doing lyric commissions for uh, the singer Sapphire, she would come in and be like, "Hey, like I'm coming at it from this is what I want to sing about, whether we necessarily agree on that being the direction for the song or not." You know, she's like, "This is what I want to sing about, and these are like this is my vocal range. This is how I can't really bullet out words the same way that other people can. Like she's a very skilled singer, so I'm not saying that she says I can't do that. It's just that's not how the human mouth was made, and a voice actress will tell you that.
Mhm.
Sorry, voice actor will tell you that. A voice actor will tell you the limitations. And so I can't just rapid fire like I cannot write words to sound like that. I can voice them out, and that's a trick that I can do to help this singer. That way my proof of concept is stronger, right?
Mhm.
So sometimes it really is just kind of like knowing your client. So, my client will be able to find a word that kind of fits in here better, or I can choose like what perspective I want to write the song from to like surprise her and just like let her belt out on something more emotional,
Yeah.
right? And so, like, that's a client that I had built a very long relationship with over the span of like 10 plus songs.
Yeah.
I don't have that relationship when I'm talking with a client for the first time, right? And I'm not sure how much they appreciate my note taking or not, right? I'll be like, but if I just have a couple of like alternate takes, it's going to help out with that way more than just having one take and buzzing off,
Yeah.
right? So they can at least understand like my mindset. They can understand why I went with certain decisions over others. Um, But at the same time, my job isn't necessarily to change the script. And it's not really to change the script in the fan translation stuff either, right? I think that if my ethics on that had changed in between the two, then that's a little bit different than just, being a fan versus being a professional. That's just a shifting ethic,
Yeah.
right?
To some extent, with the professional, like at the end of the day, the client is what determines what you do, right? Like I remember I used to listen to what are they called? The Japanese translation company 84 or whatever.
A,
Um
yeah, I know what you're talking about. I think it's
yeah, I was
A4.
really surprised when they were talking about Xenoblade Chronicles X and their work on that because on their podcast they kind of just threw Nintendo under the bus at one point where they're just like, yeah, I mean if they ask for that, that's what we got to deliver, right? So
Hmm.
it does seem like there's definitely limitations. I think Fire Emblem they kind of got heat for as well. And I think in both cases they're just like, yep, it's the business, right? And so like the professional nature of work, I think often will like transform things in ways. And I don't know
Yeah.
if it's ever I don't know if I've heard too many like stories of people being like, "Oh yeah, making something professional made me like appreciate or enjoy it more," right? Like in some ways it always sounds like there's like a whenever you're starting to do something for money, there's like it's basically you're cutting out some layer that you previously would hold on to, I guess, kind of thing.
I don't know. I'm the kind of person that likes getting a discipline.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of like limitations
Mm.
because okay, well how it's just like let's say you have like hmm, let's say that you have a blank piece of paper and someone says draw a path on it. And then you draw some squiggly little path, right? Versus someone getting you another piece of paper with a maze printed on it and they say, "Hey, draw a path,"
Hmm.
right? It's a very different brain exercise. And both of them have their own joys,
Yeah.
right? But if you like mazes more than drawing on a blank piece of paper, you might be like, "Oh, thank God," right?
Hmm.
Versus if you like drawing on a blank piece of paper, you're like, "Ah, the maze thing's kind of, you know? So, like, I think that most creative based jobs probably function like that to people at first, right? I think that the more traumatizing thing I'd be scared of is, like, doing all this work on something and then it getting canceled, right?
Mm,
And so it's like, ugh, that would be a bigger gripe for
yeah,
me. But there's also something kind of like you want to do well by a work, and I think that it's good to be frustrated when you can't, right? Um, but at the same time, I do think that I'm at that stage where I'm not at a point to complain about the enemy because I've never really been approached by the enemy in that
yeah,
way, right? Like market research doesn't apply to me because the market wants nothing to do with me,
yeah,
right? If that makes
yeah, yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Um, and that's not like a bad defeatist sort of thing either, right? But it's one of those things that I look forward to, like getting better to like approach that ring,
Mm,
you know? It's like, oh, all right, the Elite Four. So maybe, well, the Elite Four is kind of still the same Pokemon fights and stuff as the original, like 8 gym leaders, right? But it's the Elite Four. So there's still some different rules and stuff to it. Like one setback there can really set you back, I suppose, right? But they also have these teams that they talk about localization with. Whereas I kind of like work solo,
yeah,
right? But I've developed enough of a mindset and an ability to explain what I'm going for that I don't think I'm really scared of how to present myself to a client just yet,
gotcha.
right? But I also had people like look over my resume for me and be like, "Hey, help me out with my resume and stuff, please." And then like, "You misspelled this on your resume and you want a job in this?" And I was like, you know, so
It happens. It happens to the best of us, honestly.
yeah,
So,
I know. I would know because I am no, I'm kidding, but it's just, yeah, like you run into those, and I think about the typo on the resume more than I think about like any hardships necessarily with the
yeah,
job. But I'll say, hey, listen, like this is kind of partial. This isn't, this I have explanations for where I went with the script. Obviously, these are the literal translations and stuff that you can kind of go with and write your own.
yeah.
Here's the context where this appears. One thing that I did was like very linear. I think I can say that much, right? So another thing that I have was extremely compartmentalized and like things were split up. And I was just like, depending on how this unlocks, this could be this, or this, right?
Mm,
Because to write like a dynamic, to write a literal dub or a literal script or a literal graphic, like you just have to write the translation to fit within that graphic, to fit within that movie clip, to fit in whatever.
mhm,
To write something dynamic and engaging, right? And I don't necessarily mean it just to entertain adults. I do think that I think about this with my nephew and my niece, right? Like they're kids. My entire way of explaining things is completely fucking lost on kids, right? And it's not necessarily that they can't understand it. I can't explain myself to a 6-year-old,
yeah.
right? Nintendo has different demands on how they can explain themselves to a 6-year-old, right? Level 5, Professor Layton. You have these puzzles, right? You have like 200 plus puzzles per game. To make a puzzle game like that well for children and advertise it for children, you need to, on some level, make those puzzles solvable to a 6-year-old. And that might sour the experience for an adult, but it says a lot that they still managed to make such a game, right?
You're saying that, and
And
like I'm
so
having this moment of just like I remember like in my 20s struggling with Professor Layton.
it's tricky. Oh no, like, but typically, if you look at the graphics, there is typically two ways to solve any
Yeah,
puzzle, and one of them is entirely visual,
yeah,
right? Like they can give you a riddle about what hat to wear in December, and they can list off when these hats are worn, and they go, which hat is worn in December?
mhm,
And there's only one winter cap in the drawing. The answer will be the winter cap,
yeah,
right? So, like typically, like once you kind of like have your third eye open for Professor Layton games, there is typically a clue in the graphics that will tell you exactly what is going on with the puzzle.
mm,
But unless you're going through those slider ones that are tricky, right? But like another one that gets people is like the two female rats. How many babies will they have? Right? Like a 6-year-old could hypothetically solve that. But like it becomes harder as you get that ability to overthink it.
gotcha.
Right?
Yeah,
But it's still technically solvable. The game is still playable to a 6-year-old, right?
mm,
Once you get into the harder like new game plus puzzles and stuff, sure, you are absolutely right. But A 6-year-old should hypothetically be able to play that game. And that was one of the concepts in the Japanese version of the game too, is that littler kids should be able to play it. So I do think that Nintendo probably goes into that with like a different demand for that as well, right? If a game is E for everyone, everyone should hypothetically be able to play it,
Yeah.
right? If a game is T for teens, like you might want to throw Shakespearean soliloquy into it, but that might not work, right? I think that was one of the bigger gripes with War of the Lions, right? I might like Shakespearean text, right? But there's a very different enemy between writing Vagrant Story to do that and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance,
Mm.
right? Final Fantasy needs a different, or not Tactics Advance, but Final Fantasy Tactics WOL. Um, there are different demands because they have different audiences,
And I
right?
think, correct me if I'm wrong, the later release of that, they changed how it was written, right? Like, I think they re-released it with a different script for the Lions.
For War of the Lions?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I've never played Tactics, so. But
I'm actually not sure what came out after War of the Lions, if not just a port of the first version.
yeah, I could
So
be wrong. I'm not gonna die on this hill because I don't actually know. But I
yeah,
think I think
no,
I
it's
think the
okay. Me
PSP
neither.
version they may have like changed the translation or something. I think people were upset that it was not the Shakespearean thing. And like I get assuming this isn't just a
No,
story
no,
I
no, no, no.
fabricated in
So,
my head. It's an interesting thought on like, hey, yeah, maybe that just isn't the audience for this, right? And that when we're making a
so
Final Fantasy game should fit.
The PlayStation one has a way more blunt translation.
Oh,
One
okay.
of everyone's favorite quotes is "Animals have no god,"
Mm,
right? Which is very much just like it's a neat, raw little line,
yeah.
right? Woohoo! Um, and then the PSP version upped it. They added some dub segments and stuff. Really pretty dub, right? It had some FMV stuff in it. This was kind of coming off of the cuff of Final Fantasy 12, right?
Gotcha.
Which was also really lauded for its dub. And I think this is when, like, after Vagrant Story, I think is when they tried to give Evilise like this voice,
Yeah.
right? And like make it really fucking British, I guess, right? Which isn't really a problem for me.
Americans like
But
it, so
that kind of ties into I need to be open minded against my like Japanese to American English pipeline in my head. But for games like Octopath Traveler, Final Fantasy, War of the Lions, things like that that they just kind of market more openly, I think that they kind of screw themselves over by making the text too complex,
gotcha.
right? Like for something like Great Ace Attorney, where it is something that you read, right? It is a detective story. I think that versus the other ones, it's sort of allowed to have because it's more of a visual novel. I think it's allowed to have a little bit more of a complex script to it. And but I think that for other games like Octopath Traveler, it felt like a setback when I was playing it. And so it's like I could see people really kind of falling off on this because the text isn't really serving things, right? I think that that's just kind of the nature of some games. That could be personal gripe, but I sat on that gripe for a long time. I'm like, I feel like this is just really difficult to read.
Yeah.
And it wasn't making me want to play through the repetitive gameplay, right? So, whereas if I'm hopping on to just read something, I can sit around and just read something more complex, right? Because that's all I hopped on to do. I didn't hop on to fight
I
orcs.
kind of lost track of like what this had to do with you being interested in professional translation work and just like writing for the right audience. Is that what you were kind of trying to get to with this?
I was talking about the audience thing, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
you're kind of talking about Nintendo kind of putting the hammer on 8-4 about certain
yeah,
things.
yeah.
And I
Okay,
haven't listened to that, so I don't really know the context of that. So I kind of had to just throw a dart. I remember something from Bravely Default 2, or not 2, but second layer, end
hmm
layer.
hmm
Yeah, end layer. And when that was coming out, um, what was it just called? Bravely Second, I think it was. It was Bravely Second end layer. The one with like the cowgirl outfit. It used to be a native costume design. And you get those character classes by like killing the boss that has it, right? And they they had an interview about it in some magazine, and the one that they were interviewing said, "Hey, listen, it wasn't the original game's intention to offend either, so we can't translate the game well or accurately if we just add in the intent to offend
yeah.
by keeping it." And I thought that that was just a very pragmatic way to look at it. So I always kind of appreciated that because it really does take some of the responsibility and the principle of the matter off of the immediate text and the immediate graphic or something like that being
Mm,
changed. It's like if it wasn't the original game's intent to do this, then that's just one more reason to change it. Although sometimes you do have games that are like adding in shock value,
yeah.
right? And then what do you do with those games with the shock value, right? Nintendo probably came up with the decisions on what they were releasing and they're aware of the shock value before handing it to the localizer script wise. That might not be in every case, right?
Mhm.
But I imagine they did enough knowing what they were making the first time before handing it off for someone to change, right?
Yeah. Or at
Um,
least at some point in the process when you're starting to localize something, a different set of eyes are getting on it at that point. And it's like, oh, hey, maybe don't kind of thing, right?
right, right. So someone could be like, hey, we want to make a note about this. What can we do?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think that with the communication there and stuff is great. And that's communication you're not really going to have by taking shortcuts, right? You kind of have to go this roundabout way and talk about the game to do well by the game, right? So ultimately, I think that as people talk about the game and use like their tools to manually look at it, like the game is only going to get better, right?
Yeah. In a professional sense, you
Um,
also have like access to the people who made it originally, right? And so like,
well, that depends,
well, you
right? Like
can maybe I
especially
should
with so
say.
many
So
retro games being brought back, especially, I think that there are people entering the industry and stuff like that that are running into similar issues with us fan translators, where it's like you might have old press info, but you might not have more modern
yeah,
access to find other solutions, right?
yeah,
There's a win or a lose, right? I think thinking back on it, Blaze Blue has a song that they never kept the lyrics for. So everyone's like, "What the fuck are the lyrics to the song?" And like officially, they're like, "We don't know." And it's just like you fucking sang the song. Where are the lyrics? They're never documented anywhere, and they're like, we kind of just don't have them.
yeah.
So that might not always help, right? If they ever had to make an English version of the song, it would have to be made up, I guess. So unless they provided that, but so who knows? I think that Japanese games kind of have a notorious history with bookkeeping.
Mhm.
So thinking back on if I were to localize certain retro games or something, I think that those would be interesting things to have brought up in
Yeah.
context. So
Going back to fan translation, obviously, when you do fan translation work,
yes,
personal that is your own personal choice to spend time on that, right? Like you don't need to do this. You don't need to necessarily, pursue this if you don't want to. Obviously, there's probably little different things in your head that, like, keep you doing it, and you may or may not know what those are. I get that problem all the time when I'm making videos. Like sometimes, like, why are you making this? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know why I'm here anymore. I'm just doing it because it feels like the right thing to do. But I'm curious. Do you have any sense of like, you're putting all this time and work into basically translating somebody else's work for a different audience and like expanding that reach? Like, what do you think drives you to do that? Maybe.
well, for me personally, and I think this is kind of like where most fans start,
Hmm.
right? You want to learn to be able to read things to have a better understanding for it yourself,
Yeah.
right? When I play a game, even in English, I kind of just like zone off, and go duh duh duh, og press o, og make barrel, og throw barrel,
Mm.
right? Um, but it's just a different way to enjoy something when you kind of put on like the glasses and you sit down and you open up the book. It opens up a different part of your brain,
Mm.
and it's not really a part of my brain that I would really be looking at and stuff and opening up playing a game in English for the first time, right? Unless I really wanted to. But if I want to study Japanese and I want to get good at this sort of thing, it's like cool. I can take this bit by bit. I have a method now. It's not necessarily whether someone requests a game from me,
Yeah.
right? Unless, like, say, Esper was like, "Hey, listen, I have this dream game," or Alex is like, "I have this
Well,
dream
that's kind of
game,"
your
or something,
scratching the
right?
back kind of thing, right? Versus like somebody just,
The scratching of the
yeah,
backs, right?
versus someone just reaching
I
out
can
to you and being
entertain
like,
it.
hey, what if you translate something on the 3DS or something. I don't know, like some random game. I don't know.
Right. You get it. You get some people that will just kind of DM. And I don't want to say some people like they're, just some people and stuff like that, but like even friends and stuff like that, I think will be very prone to just message, "Hey, like did you know about this game?" and then proceed to like teach you about this
Yeah.
game for like 12 posts down, And like, it'd be really neat if it had a translation. And you know exactly what that whole little essay segment was about, right? But it's like I'm not just going to like pick up a game, right? That easily.
Yeah.
It has to interest me first. And I think that's where it kind of ties down into like my interests. Like I have like art interests, I have certain music interests, I have certain writing interests that all kind of tie in. Like there are certain settings I want to check out,
Yeah.
right? Like I had poked Hilltop about Boku 2 because I like the ocean. I was like, do that one over one, please.
Yeah.
Do not worry about one. This one takes place by the ocean. It is a million times better, right? And so then like Hilltop played it and Hilltop enjoyed it on his own terms,
Mhm.
right? And that's how Hilltop had put all of that like blood, sweat, and tears and stuff of his into book two,
Yeah.
right? So it wasn't necessarily even about the script. It wasn't really about the story of the game. It really was just I like the ocean side.
Mm.
I'll make barrel, right? And that worked out for Boku too, right? So like there are certain themes and stuff like that I like to play. There are certain like worlds I like to be in and stuff as well,
Mm.
right? And if I'm immersing myself into that world, like it takes a lot of work as an adult to immerse yourself into something, I think, for the sake of doing it,
Yeah.
right? But if you can kind of make it your homework and stuff too, this is a dangerous thing. Like, don't always make your passions your homework, right? But and when you do that and you do well, right?
Mhm.
And you do get to meet people through it and stuff. It's like, oh, now I have a Kalunscape friend that I can enjoy all this Kalunscape stuff with,
Yeah.
right? And so that was a big reward for me, more so than just me trying to be the guy and getting things wrong because I was scared of being corrected, right? And I think that even with like Linda, like having the relationship that I built up with Esper and stuff, and having like the small relationships with other people that like either chipped in or got really rude or something like that along the way, right? Um, like they shaped my impression and they shaped my relationship with Linda as well,
Mm.
right? And so, like, it's not even just about I looked at the script a long time and that built a relationship with it. It really is the other people's involvement, right? For better or for worse, right? Like, there are some people that had said some things about me during the course of the Linda thing that just made me very anxious to work on it. And typically, if I have those dramas and stuff like that with people, it's like it was another translator. So, and like I said my piece to this translator and stuff like that, and I just kind of like tried to move on and stuff like that. But it got to the point where I was like, getting physically sick at the thought of just like working on the script because I pictured this person being a fucking parrot over my
Yeah.
shoulder, right? And it was someone that wasn't engaging with my work and they were coming up with a preconceived like notion, right? And you run into a lot of people running on preconceptions as well. And I think that them being very vocal without taking the 10 minutes it takes to know what the fuck they're talking about to make people kind of scared to engage
Yeah.
too, if that makes sense. So I think that kind of ties into the whole being scared of being corrected thing
Yeah.
that kind of comes with like why you have to have like the correct thing or the best looking thing or a portfolio, right? You need a LinkedIn just to talk about fucking video games anymore. So,
I think I mean I fall into this
um,
trap a lot of times where it's like you feel like you
mhm,
can make assumptions about who a person is based off often very limited information, right?
right.
And like I have done that with like other content creators in a way that I'm not really happy or proud about how I feel about like somebody's work, and sometimes based off very limited information. Like sometimes I can like see somebody's thumbnail and not like the 4 words they put in a thumbnail and be like, I don't like your videos.
Hmm.
I'm not gonna watch this. And like that's my whole thing that I've built my assumption based off them, right? And so I think being able to like
Right.
have that a little bit more in-depth conversation about it. I mean, I don't necessarily know how that thing worked out with that, but I think it's good to engage more before you just start talking about other people online. But that's just like what I feel like I have learned. Am I
Right.
healed of it? I don't know yet, but I feel like it's a lot more valuable to learn more about somebody before you say anything, kind of thing. So, but
Right. I do think that there's a certain due diligence that you need to like look at people, right? Like, even, like, hey, it's courteous to look at someone's bio and pick up their pronouns before talking with them, right? It's an unspoken rule of the internet. It's to just peek, right? And it saves you getting corrected later, right? But even then, if you know how to take that correction well and just run with
Mhm.
it, you can have a great conversation with somebody, right? If you just kind of don't look at that and then you get upset when you get corrected or something because boo, I can't believe I have to get corrected. Like that makes you weird to talk to.
Mhm.
About video games or about anything else, right?
Yeah.
Um, if you're caught not doing your due diligence there, right? Like how you react to that is very
Yeah.
important, right? Like not to toot my own horn, but again with the Calenscape thing, like I was wrong as fuck with how I handled that lexicon sheet, right? Because there are a couple very critical settings questions I failed to ask about
Yeah.
Calenscape. But in my defense there, I think I was open to that by finding someone first before just publishing anything and releasing it,
Yeah.
right? And then just expanding on that relationship with this person. And so I think that was the best thing to happen with Linda, right? Or Callan, sorry. It was the best thing to happen with Callan's Gate. And then we spoke with a linguist. Thirdly, we've asked people from basically every language that gets referenced in the game. We have like Vietnamese feedback, we have like Cantonese, we have some Mandarin feedback as well. We have British English. We have we've managed to speak with everyone that gets some kind of like inclusion in the game, right? And I think that kind of just happened on accident, right? I wasn't like, I'm going to just make the game inclusive, right? But in the path to making it accurate
Mhm.
to the original text, that was just what had to happen, right? And I think if I did just rely on a machine or if I did just rely on my own individual writing chops and stuff, I there was definitely a part of the planning process where I was taking a shortcut or I was not asking the right questions, right?
Yeah.
So I think it was a I think that even if it is a lot of individual writers coming in to kind of pitch with that, right? I think that one person doing it by themselves was certainly possible. It just wasn't me. And so I had to ask those questions and I had to kind of look around and stuff like that. But I do think that Colin's Gate is genuinely better because of it.
I feel like when we get a lot of these tools that kind of let everybody have the ability to do something, it can be like a really empowering feeling being able to be somebody who, in this case, has no knowledge of Japanese, no ability to communicate, no ability to understand, what's going on in a different, language and different culture and things like that. It feels like you're getting an immense amount of insight that you would never have access to normally, without that tool kind of thing, right? But I think what really stood out to me when I was talking to Cargodin about this is kind of the idea of like, I don't know if it's like a false sense of confidence or empowerment or what, where the way these tools can present this information can be in some ways like almost misleading, right? It's like, I guess, like without the proper understanding of how something works, you really have no idea, how accurate it is or isn't. But if something like cleans it up in a way where you and your gut feeling as a normal person look at it and it looks normal, then why would you question it, right? One of the things that I think is really interesting about like camera translation tools is just how horribly broken the text can be sometimes versus Google Translate or DeepL where you're just like directly translating the text. And I feel like in those moments, I would say I probably have less faith in the text in front of me, not so much because the information I'm getting is different, but because the way it's like how it's presented and things like that, right? Cargodin mentioned throughout it, just like, hey, people will utilize these things as ways to try to like correct translators and things like that, but they are placing their trust in because the text they see on the other side looks right and feeds into like the narrative that they're trying to build. They can use that as a way to basically look at somebody and say, hey, you translated this wrong, or you intentionally translated this a different way. I think it's kind of sad that it's just like it is a tool that can be used in combination with like somebody's lack of trust in others to, try to degrade somebody else and try to like question their their intent and like bring, sometimes a mob of people online after somebody. I don't know if Cargodin's ever gone through that, but it's definitely something I see with translators as a whole, where somebody really gets targeted. And again, I don't know this stuff well enough to say how true or not true any of that stuff is, but at the end of the day, translators are people that I don't think get paid well, or in the case of fan translations, get paid at all. I think it is very much a passion project and something that, I think is deserving of respect, however it turns out in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously there's going to be some exceptions. I don't want to speak for that community. I'm sure there's good and bad things that happen throughout there, right? But I think that's something that I guess it's a little sad to see it kind of get used that way. But check out Cargodin's stuff. Like I mentioned earlier, I played Blue Legend of Water before, as well as Napple. I think those translations were really good and great. And, I think Cargodin's voice really fit those games well, especially Napple. I feel like Napple for some reason fits very well with I feel like what I know about Cargodin in terms of just their interests and things like that. And while I haven't played them, you should probably check out Linda Cube and Planet Laika. Maybe someday I'll look at them. I'm really finicky when it comes to games. It's really hard to know what I'll end up playing. So who knows? Maybe someday those games will. So in my head, I made this imagery of CDs flying into my eyeballs and going up eyelids. I don't know where that came from, but I guess those two games, I'll burn them and shove them up my eyelids. I'm going to leave that in. We're just going to leave that in. It's going to be good. Cargodin posts on, I believe, Twitter and Blue Sky. I will have any relevant links. I know they mentioned their blog and stuff like that as well. I think that's really cool that the blog is like a place where it's like, hey, come criticize me, please. I think anyone being open to criticism, I think is always a really good thing. I wish I could help in giving feedback in that, but obviously I don't understand Japanese, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go machine translate it and go put in some comments and be like, I think you meant boku no not Maisumi. I don't know. I lost this joke. Anyways, go check those out. Check out the links. Go check out any of Cargodin's games and all that stuff.